The Macedonian phalanx. Why was it such a big deal? That's what I want to discuss. I just got done watching one of the best history videos I think I've seen on YouTube by the Sand Age Roman channel describing the origins of the phalanx and some of the academic debates surrounding it and its impact and this type of thing. And so I thought I would make a video putting the stuff out there for the everyday person, because the phalanx formation is a strangely interesting thing to study in history. It was very, very impactful and had an effect on things off the battlefield. It affected political structures, it affected social norms and how people went about things in kind of a crazy way. Now, that's a kind of thing that I would be skeptical of if someone were to tell me. Academics really like to make as big of a deal out of little things as they can and connect dots and use terms like second and third order consequences and what have you. Yeah, connect dots where maybe they don't really connect, because that's going to generate a lot of thesis and peer-reviewed papers and journals and this type of thing. So people often get carried away with that type of historical inquiry. But in the case of the Macedonian phalanx and the traditional phalanx, it really is interesting in that way, and in practical ways. It touches on not just politics, but human group dynamics and human psychology and game theory. All those things come into play as to why it was so successful and why it was so impactful. So if you will bear with me, I'm going to do my best to try to explain why the phalanx formations and then the Macedonian phalanx, two different types of phalanx formations that had distinct impacts, as I'll get into. They really are interesting. So I'm going to try my best to explain why. So for anyone unfamiliar with it, a phalanx formation was made up of heavy infantry. In Greece was called they were called hoplites, which doesn't really translate well into English. When you think of hoplite, you don't think of someone heavily armored and violent, but that's exactly what it referred to in Greek. So these guys had full big helmets, chest armor, shin guards, forearm guards. They carried a spear in their right hand, and with their entire left forearm, a huge shield. That was a hoplite warrior. And when they got to the battlefield, they would interlock their shields into a wall and just push forward. And they were the best thing on the battlefield for about 400 years. And then the Macedonian phalanx came along and added another 200 years to it. So for over 600 years, phalanxes were the best thing out there. Phalanx formations beat non-phalanx formations. And the most powerful thing about them is how they were able to break enemy formations. They were the ultimate formation breaker. And that's how you lose a battle, is when your formation breaks. And this is why often smaller armies haven't been able to defeat larger armies. Once the cohesion is gone, once the rally points, it's kind of every man for himself, then you've lost the battle. And phalanx formations were the best thing out there for that. So it was these heavily armed hoplites, these heavily armed infantry guys interlocking their shields, where about half of your shield on your left forearm was protecting the right half of the guy to your left, and it was closed in and tight in that kind of way, and it gave them a big psychological advantage, because phalanx formations were almost impossible to break unless you had another phalanx formation. And a big reason why is because the guys were locked in, because there was nowhere to run. If you're in a looser formation, you're going to be looking around. People are going to be very sensitive on the battlefield. Say, is my side about to lose? Because once those defenses go down, once the enemy starts to break through, that's when the brave men die, as it was said. It's if you're reaching that point, you want to take off as quickly as possible if you want to increase your chances of survival. But in phalanx formations, there was nowhere to run. You were locked in, and you knew in your head that the guy in front of you and the guy behind you and the guy to your left and your right was also locked in. They weren't going anywhere. You were all in it together, do or die. And something that always went along with phalanx formations, with city-states that fielded them, were strong social consequences and legal consequences for cowardice on the battlefield. So these societies just placed a huge premium on valor on the battlefield. In Sparta, they said, come home with your shield or on it, meaning come home in victory or come home dead. You didn't want to come home any other way. And so nobody was running anywhere. Even the guys on the outside who could have, they weren't going to run because that would have um, that would have been the death penalty, and even their families would have faced consequences. Like in Sparta, someone who showed cowardice on the battlefield, his sisters would have a hard time finding a husband. That would affect their marriage prospects. So these societies put a huge premium on bravery and severely, severely punished battlefield cowardice. That was a necessary part of fielding a phalanx formation. Is everybody knew, hey, nobody's going anywhere. I'm not running, and neither was anybody else, and that gave them a huge, huge advantage on the battlefield. And in many cases, it really encouraged this workout culture. This is where the term gymnasium comes from. So a phalanx formation is a lot like a line in football or in rugby, where you're pushing, and you're trying to break the enemy's line. And a lot of times, the guy in the second and third row, they would be pushing the guy in the front row, so he's incurring a whole lot of pressure up there on the front. But the whole thing was push, push, shove, and break the enemy's formation. So in the same way that a rugby or a football lineman is going to benefit from spending time in the gym and bench pressing a lot of weight, exercising to the point where he can, and squatting a lot and deadlifting a lot, or whatever names they gave to them, that was going to give you a big advantage. And so the guys worked out like beasts. Not in every case. Some of the remains of hoplites, some of the mass graves that have been uncovered, show that this wasn't always the case. Carthaginian hoplites, for instance, didn't seem to have spent much time in the gym. And you can tell these things by muscle connection points and bone density. But Greek hoplites and Roman heavy infantry as well, these guys spent time in the gym. These guys worked out. And it makes sense. If you can think of the advantages to working out in the gym on the football field, it's going to you'll have a better chance of victory. You'll have a better chance of getting a better contract or this type of thing. But in the arena of combat, it can make the difference between life and death. It can mean the difference between victory and all the spoils that come with that, or your city gets burned to the ground and everyone gets killed or sold into slavery and that type of thing. So there was a lot of incentive for these guys to really hit the gym. And as we know now for certain, they did. So these guys were big, bulky. There was a tremendous amount of camaraderie, if you can imagine these types of things in there. They were a scary thing to face. These big, muscly guys locked in, not going anywhere. You weren't going to break their formation. I think of traditional phalanxes as being similar to, they're kind of like the stump grinder of the battlefield. If anyone's ever seen a stump grinder, a yard tool to grind down stumps of trees, and it just grinds slowly, just tears it to shreds. That's kind of how I imagine a phalanx formation, and that's sort of how they operated. Big beefy guys who worked out. They were covered head to toe in armor and just broke through any enemy formations, and that's what won for 400 years. Phalanx formations beat everything else. There were some battles, like with Persia, where they got surrounded, or an army was outnumbered by 10-1 in these types of things. But very, very rare. If you had a phalanx formation, you were going to beat the other guy unless they also had a phalanx formation. Yeah, it allowed those who utilized it to overcome much, much larger armies. Perhaps most famously, the Spartans. So we know that the Spartans, the Dorians, the sons of Heracles, who settled in the Greek Peloponnese, conquered and brutally subjugated a fellow Greek population that was between 8 to 10 times their size. And in their own story of how they were able to do that, they credit it to the phalanx formation and their use of it, and the fact that the Helots did not have the phalanx formation. They were more disorganized. They called it a gift from the gods. That was how powerful and impactful this phalanx formation was. So where did it come from? What are the origins of this? And this, I'm not going to get into the details as Sand H. Roman did, but it's an interesting topic in itself and something I'll touch on. Now, if we go back to the Bronze Age, the age that preceded, there was the Bronze Age and then this period of chaos. But in the Bronze Age, battlefield warrior aristocrats oftentimes determined the course of battle. Bronze was scarce, so only a few members of an army had bronze weapons and armors. Everybody else was a Stone Age warrior. They had no armor or wooden swords or slings. That's what most of the Egyptian army, most of the Hittite army looks like. So it was these aristocratic warriors with bronze weapons who, in their skirmishes with one another, determined the course of battles. They were the tanks of their age. So it was an age of warrior heroes, people whose actual swordcraft and arrow shooting and spear throwing determined the course of battle. And it was also the age, if anyone has seen the movie Troy, or you've read the Iliad, you're familiar with the Agamemnon called upon Achilles to fight, I forgot the name, Boethius, I think, of the big guy on the enemy team, and one-on-one, and whoever won, that would determine victory. People in the Bronze Age did those kinds of things. It was the age of warrior heroes. But then along came iron. That changed everything, and it led to about 300 years of a Mad Max apocalyptic landscape. That was from between about 1150 BC until about 850, 800 BC, when civilization finally started to get going again, because violence had been democratized. Now everybody had iron weapons. Iron is not scarce. Iron is all over the place. So everybody had the iron weapons. And phalanx formations coming out of the mountains, where these remnants of civilization continued to exist on a much smaller scale during this period. That seems to have been a big part of how civilization got going again. Now, for 300 years in the Aegean and the Mediterranean and all of the places where you would expect to see big cities and lowlands, along rivers, along coasts, there weren't any, because if anyone got one started, if you made anything too nice, pirates and robber barons were going to come and take it from you. So civilization was very isolated. It was very up in the hills for that period of time. And that's where the stories of Achilles and Hector and the Iliad and the Odyssey got started. People telling these stories around fires at night and bards passing them down until they finally seem to have been written down during the Archaic Age. But that's where this phalanx formation seemed to have gotten started. And it kind of makes sense how it would have. It's a great defensive formation. So pirates and robber barons, they're coming up the mountain. What better way than to have this shield wall and just push them back down? And that's kind of how it got started, it would seem, before they realized, hey, this is very effective, and we don't need it to use it only for defense, before they got lower and lower and finally kind of retook these centers and were able to build cities like Rome and Athens and get things going again. But it took advantage in this battle that was taking place between the robber barons and the pirates versus the civilization builders. It allowed the civilization builders to take advantage of one big advantage they had. That was a willingness to die, because that's what you were committing yourself to if you got locked into that phalanx formation. You weren't going to go anywhere, and if you died, if you lost, you were going to die along with the guys to your right and to your left. There was nowhere to run. You were locked in, and it took advantage of that, because pirates and robbers, they're going to have a limited willingness to take too much risk. They're just in it for the loot. And so it was a big part of what what got civilization going again, the phalanx formation. And then it got bigger and bigger, and seems to have been a big part of what allowed them to then conquer the lowlands and get things going again. And that brought about the Archaic and the Classical Age. Now, for 400 years, once this phalanx formation, they started appearing, they started conquering. That was the most powerful thing on the battlefield. It was an age of both no battlefield heroes and no great generals. Phalanx formations, the traditional phalanx formations, did not have great generals. There just really wasn't much need for great generalship. There wasn't a whole lot of tactics to it. You just brought this thing to the battlefield. You set it up on the right terrain. There were some things, of course. picking the right territory, knowing when to surrender, things like this. And there were great generals, such as during the Peloponnesian War, but they were great because of their statesmanship, because of their doggedness, their ability to press the advantage or surprise their enemy, and this type of thing. But as far as the tactics on the battlefield, it was the same as it had always been. Just guys smashing into one another in these blocks, and whoever broke first lost. So not an age of great generals. There's something kind of dark about that when I think of it. No, Stalin would have liked that. It seems kind of Soviet and brutalist. No heroes, no great generals, just these kind of replaceable, faceless, nameless men operating in a group. There was really no room for the individual. But of course, Stalin, it was very un-Soviet in other ways. In order to fight in a phalanx formation, you had to be a land-owning male. And that's something that we see in pretty much every case where phalanx formations were fielded, is that a requirement was being a land-owning male. You had stake in the society. Those two things went together almost 100% of the time. And it led to this age of more democratic forms of government. Now, on this point, the Sand H Roman video gets into it. There is some debate. There are some people who refer to themselves as revisionists on this narrative of the traditional phalanx formation, and they question this, whether or not phalanx formations led to more democratic forms of government, because they cannot see a direct link or a direct law or this type of thing. And I think that's a fair cynicism when someone tries to attribute things to spirit, to the fact that this was the first time in history that aristocrats and the middle class were fighting side by side. They were taking equal risks on the battlefield, and they had equal responsibilities. You might want something more than that to really make a determinative cause and effect type of thing. However, we see this in 100% of the cases. If we can avoid getting into the details of what technically constitutes a democracy versus an aristocracy, or versus a monarchy, or this type of thing, wherever you see phalanx formations, you see a broad distribution of power in their political system 100% of the time. So in Athens, there was straight up democracy. Although you had to be a landowning male, you had to qualify for fighting in the phalanx formation was a privilege, and the aristocracy and the middle class were fighting together. That part would be very un-Soviet. That part Stalin would not have liked. Those were the people that communists didn't like. Yeah, but nameless, faceless, and it certainly led to more representative forms of government, even in Sparta. So Sparta had two kings, but they were weak. It had a senate. It had priests with tremendous amounts of power, government officials, positions, and they rotated. That had a whole lot of power. They could put people on trial. So a broad distribution of power went hand in hand. And in Rome, of course, you had a republic with their system, and consuls that took turns every year, and something very similar in Carthage. So I think it's very fair to say that this type of fighting went hand in hand with democracy, or with more representative forms of government, because you see it in 100% of the cases. So while it is true that correlation does not equal causation, I think that these revisionists are setting the bar of evidence too high, and requiring something that you're never going to see. Some philosopher of the time describing this particular link, although many did. Thucydides described this in his history of the Peloponnesian War, how democracies and phalanx formations kind of went together. Aristotle touched on this, but you don't really need a direct link that we could look at in order to connect the dots on this one. You see it in 100% of the cases. And then later on, as the Macedonian phalanx comes into play, as I'll describe here in a minute, as soon as it became the age of military dynasts, those democratic representative forms of government started to go away. Now, before getting into the Macedonian phalanx, one other point that I want to touch on regarding some of the controversies about the origin of the phalanx that were discussed in the Sand H Roman video is, did the phalanx originate at a point in time, or was it more something that evolved as some of the revisionists have tried to make the case for. So they would say that the phalanx formation may have come into being because, well, you had an army fielded, and some of the guys were fighting in looser formations, and then a few of them were overlapping their shields, and then slowly over time it evolved into something more structured. Anything is possible. I think that this is not really one of the more important. It's almost futile to argue about it, how it got started, but it would certainly seem to be more of a point in time thing. It would certainly they had to be set up in a certain way. There had to be some set of agreements. There had to be some set of command. There had to be a commander or a statesman, leader, saying, we're going to approach the battlefield this way. We're going to lock shields, and here's how it works. And if you run, we're going to kill you, and you have to do it. It's very much seems like a point in time thing as opposed to something that evolved. You were either fielding a phalanx formation or you weren't. There really is no evidence of this kind of in-betweenism other than stuff that some of these revisionists have pointed to on vases. So on vases, but what is that really going to tell us? Anything is possible, but for whatever my opinion is worth, not much. The point in time theory, the traditionalist theory of the origin of the phalanx formation would seem to make a lot more sense. So during this 400 years, it was a period of independent nation states to the west of the Persian Empire. So the Persian Empire is kind of its own thing. It arranged itself differently, obviously, but throughout the rest of the Mediterranean, what you saw was you saw small independent states like Rome, like Athens, sometimes forming into leagues or like the Delian League or something like that, but it was not an age of conquest or empire. And part of that for sure was just how heavy these phalanx formations were. They were great for defense. They were great for attacking your neighbor so long as you weren't going very far. But as far as conquering people far away, that was going to be a problem because you had to lug all of this weight, all of this armor, over a long distance. It just wasn't very good for conquest. So that was the geopolitics of the Mediterranean and the Aegean for those 400 years, from between about 800 BC until the early part of the 4th century when things started to change. So now the Macedonian phalanx, because while a phalanx, it changed things dramatically. Philip II brought this about. So Philip II came to the throne of Macedon in 359 BC. And one of the more interesting things, underappreciated things about the Hellenistic age, about this unification of Greece and then facing off against Persia and conquering Persia and beyond, is how sudden and out of nowhere and unexpected it was. Nobody saw it coming before it happened. When Philip II came to the throne of Macedon in 359 BC, Macedon was a third-rate Greek power that was ceasing to make sense as an independent political entity. It was losing ground to the Illyrians and to the Pannonians, and it lost a lot of ground to the Thracians, and was showing it that it was incapable of defending its own borders. It was coming more and more under the thumb of Thebes. Things did not look good for Macedon when Philip II came to the throne. And the Greek world, there was nothing happening in the Greek world that really would have clued anyone in to the idea that Greek unification was on the horizon. Greece was humming along as it had been for about 350 years. These independent city-states that would form into leagues, and then they would fight each other over land or this type of thing on an annual basis. Usually low-scale warfare, but sometimes it would erupt into things like the Peloponnesian War. That was life in Greece when Philip II came to the throne. As it had been, nothing that you could look at would say, hey, Greece is about to fall under the thumb of a hegemonic power. No one saw it coming. And the relationship between Greece and Persia at the time was also about as it had been from the beginning. So for 200 years, the relationship with Greece and between the Persian Empire and the Greek world, there was a lot of trade. Persia always loved to hire Greek mercenaries. Persia had given up on trying to directly conquer Greece as they tried in the early part of the 5th century, but they were always meddling in Greek affairs and trying to make sure that no one really got too powerful. No one saw this Macedonian phalanx coming and this new way of fighting and the conquest of Persia. It was an amazing event. This is what Philip II brought to Macedon by creating this Very, very new style of army. But there's a prelude to this that I have to touch on. There's a guy named Episthemandes. Philip II spent time in his youth as a hostage in the court of Thebes, and got to see and learn from Episthemandes and a few other generals who did something extraordinary. Episthemandes figured out how to beat a traditional phalanx formation more or less by just arranging the troops differently, and demonstrated repeatedly that he could defeat larger armies in this way, just by being creative on the battlefield and by using shock tactics. Most famously in 371 BC, he did the unthinkable. He beat a larger Spartan army that had never been done in its 350 years up to that point. Spartans had lost a few battles, but only when they were overwhelmed by much larger armies, or when they were trapped on an island, as took place during the Peloponnesian War. Defeating a Spartan army man to man or anything close to it was unheard of, and yet Episthemandes managed to come along and defeat a larger Spartan army, an army of about 10,500 with 6,800 troops. I won't get too into to how he did it. If this interests anyone, you happen to come across this, you can read up on the oblique formation. But what he did for 400 years, it was assumed that you had to have your strongest troops on your right, because lines would just normally drift to the right as everybody was trying to get behind the shield of the guy to his right. And in order to prevent that, you had to have your strongest soldiers on the right, which meant that they would be facing off against the weakest soldiers of their enemy, and then vice versa. Your weakest troops were going to be against their strongest troops, and it was thought that there was just no other way to do it. Well, Episthemandes came up with an idea. He said, hey, how about we stack a long, narrow column, very deep, of elite troops on our weak side facing their strong side, and just punch a hole through their strong side. That's the short of it. It's called the oblique formation, but in this way demonstrated that if you're creative, you can defeat a traditional phalanx formation. And that changed everything. The world would never be the same. Would never be the same at that point. By being creative, by relying on shock tactics. Now, Episthemandes is still a revered character among people who, I forgot what it's called, like the path of the left, or the left-handed path, but there's a philosophy out there of people who think that the key to success is approaching everything from the left as opposed to the right, whatever the details are. And it's associated, I think, with like the Illuminati or what have you. Whatever the details are, Episthemandes is thought of as a founder of this way of thinking, and a revered character. I don't know if that's interesting to me, how that plays into it, but it was a very effective way of fighting. More than the specifics of how he arranged things, what he demonstrated was that great generalship could, it was no longer the age of who had the biggest, toughest dude bros. It was no longer going to be rule by Jim Bro linemen. Victory now went to the folks with the best general, and young, energetic, intelligent Philip II was in the court of Thebes watching this happen. He took up the mantle, went back, became the king of Macedon, and created something different. So now we'll get into what the Macedonian phalanx was and how that changed everything. So a Macedonian hoplite in this formation had much lighter armor than traditional. That gave them more mobility. In fact, they used a type of armor that was many, many layers of linen, and it was apparently very effective at stopping spears, but it was multiple layers of linen, much lighter armor. Their helmets had an open face for better visibility, sacrificing protection. They still had shin guards, much lighter armor, and a much smaller shield. They had an 18-inch shield that they wore on the upper part of their left arm, because they needed both hands to wield 20-foot spikes. So in traditional phalanxes, the spears were between 6 and 8 feet. This was obviously a big upgrade. They were 3 times the size. They were between 18 and 20 feet long. They needed both hands, and they would overlap one another. So every guy was carrying the partial weight of 3 or 4 different spears. They were interlaced under people's arms. And the effect of the Macedonian phalanx If you could sort of imagine this in your head. So you have the traditional phalanx. Let's say you're a traditional phalanx warrior fighting as you had. You got your spears, you're in the front line, you're ready to confront the enemy. Well, the first thing that you would discover in facing a Macedonian phalanx was that you were going to get stabbed. They were going to start attacking you at about 15 feet away before you could get anywhere near them, before they were even in striking distance. And then once you got within 8 to 10 feet away, you were now getting struck by two spears, the guy in the front line and the guy behind him. And then by the time you got within striking distance, you were facing 3 to 4 times as many spears. So the Macedonian phalanx was a light on defense, heavy on offense way of fighting. That was the turn that it took, and demonstrated that the best defense is a good offense. So they had lighter armor, lighter protection, but were able to more than make up for that by the fact that they were killing their opponents before their opponents ever got anywhere near them. And so, yeah, by the time that front row guy got to the Macedonian phalanx, he was facing spears from every direction, and it proved to be very, very effective, and proved to be very demoralizing. That was a point made by its opponents. People who faced the Macedonian phalanx, it was very demoralizing. And you can imagine you're getting stabbed and spears coming at you before you could get anywhere near this guy. Now when you're up close, now with your in striking distance, you're getting chopped to bits by this absolute wall of spears. And the death tolls in the early battles that Philip II fought with this Macedonian phalanx were huge, much bigger than normal in his battle with the Illyrians, and then his battle in the Sacred War. And this was in the early 350s, the late 350s, early 340s BC. So it was an amazing way to fight. However, a Macedonian phalanx could not fight all by itself. A Macedonian phalanx, in order to be fielded, had to have other components on the battlefield in order to make it effective. And that was a big change. It was very, very stiff. So traditional phalanx, that was a weak point, is that they were stiff with the guys, they're locked together. It's hard to pivot to your right or to retreat because they are so locked in. Well, the Macedonian phalanx was even stiffer because these guys had their sarissa spears interlaced with one another. And so its flanks had to be protected because it could be easily flanked. It could not, it take me a while to get into it. I won't get into the details. It had to be protected on the flanks by either light infantry or more traditional forms of infantry, like the silver shields, as they were later called, traditional phalanx hoplites, in order to protect its flanks, as well as cavalry formations. And then it went along with this companion cavalry. Again, without getting into the details, it was a new way of fielding cavalry that had some armor to them. So they were all moving at the same in a point that would allow the horses to crash in from behind. And the way that they operated is they would flank right and stretch out the enemy's formation, and then 120-degree pivot to the back and crash in one from the rear. It was called the hammer to the anvil, the phalanx formation being the anvil. So as the cavalry was stretching the line out, that was going to give more and more advantage to this phalanx formation. They were now dealing with a thinner, more dispersed line. And so the enemy was, up a creek in either case, but it required a lot of different components to work. It was similar, I've heard it best described, the Macedonian phalanx, as bringing like a missile to the battlefield, and you got one shot with it. So you had to haul a missile to the battlefield, plant it down, make sure it was on the right ground, wait for the right moment, hit the fire button. And if you did it correctly, it was just going to tear through your opponents. But it was a stiff formation that could not operate it by itself. And that was the critical thing. It now gave the advantage to who had the best generals. It was no longer the age of the biggest, toughest dude bros. It was now the guy on horseback who was best able to move the pieces on the chessboard. I think of this age as kind of like the Revenge of the Nerds. The dude bro linemen were no longer. It was now the geeky guy. It was now the smart guy. It was now the guy who was able to make the right decisions and have the right timing. That is what won battles. And it led to this age of military dynasts, conquering